From George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 30. Art. At this place of his tales, Beelzebub became silent, and turning suddenly to his old servant Ahun, who was also sitting there listening to him with the same attention as his grandson Hassien, he said, "And you, old man, are you also listening to me with the same interest as our Hassien? Weren't you yourself personally with me everywhere on that planet Earth? And didn't you see with your own eyes and sense for yourself everything about what I am relating to Hassien? Instead of just sitting there open-mouthed at my tales, you also tell our favorite something. There is no getting out of it. We've got to tell him all we can about those strange three-brained beings, seeing that they have so intensely interested him. Surely you must have been interested in one aspect or another of these queer ducks. Well, tell us something just about that aspect." When Beelzebub had finished speaking, Ahun, having thought a while, replied, "After your subtly psychological tales about all these unintelligibles, how can I intrude with my tales?" And then, with an unusual seriousness and preserving the style and even entire expressions of Beelzebub himself, he continued, "It is, of course, how shall I put it? My essence even was often thrown out of balance by those strange three-brained beings, who with their virtuoso caperings nearly always used to supply an impetus for evoking the being impulse of amazement in one or in another of my spiritualized parts." And then addressing Hassien, he said, "All right, dear Hassien, I will not, like his right reverence, relate to you in detail about any particular oddity of the psyche of those three-brained beings of our great universe who have taken your fancy. No, I will only remind his right reverence of one factor, the cause of which arose during our 5th stay on the surface of that planet, and which, when we were there for the 6th and last time, had become the chief cause why, in every one of those favorites of yours, from the very first day of their arising until their formation as responsible beings, their ableness of normal being mentation is step by step distorted and finally transformed almost into a Kaltusara." Thereupon, addressing Beelzebub himself, he with a timid look and in a hesitant tone continued to speak. "Don't blame me, your right reverence, for venturing to express to you the opinion which has just arisen in me, and which is the outcome of my reflections on data, already perhaps worn too thin for mind conclusions. While relating to our dear Hassien about all the various reasons that have brought it about that the psyche of the contemporary three-brained beings of the planet Earth, who have taken his fancy, has become transformed, as you once designed to express yourself, into a mill for grinding out nonsense, you scarcely even mentioned one factor, perhaps more important than the others, which during recent centuries has served as the basis for it. I intend to speak about that factor which has already become definitely maleficent for the contemporary beings, and at the arising of the cause of which you yourself were present, as I very well remember during our stay then in Babylon. I mean the factor they themselves call art. If you should consent in your wisdom to take up that question in detail, then, according to my understanding, our dear Hassien will have perhaps the choicest material for his better elucidation of all the abnormal strangenesses of the psyche of the three-brained beings who in most recent times arise on that planet Earth, which has interested him." Having said this, and having with the tip of his tail wiped off the drops of sweat which had formed on his forehead, Ahun became silent and adopted his usual attentive posture. With an affectionate glance, Beelzebub looked at him and said, "Thank you, old man, for reminding me of this. It is true that I have scarcely even mentioned that indeed harmful factor, created also by them themselves, for the final atrophy even of those data for their being mentation, which by chance have still survived. All the same, old man, though it's true that I have not so far once referred to it, that does not mean that I have not considered it at all. having still a good deal of time before us during the period of our traveling, I should in all probability, in the course of my subsequent tales to our common favorite, Hacian, have remembered in its time about that of which you have reminded me. However, perhaps it will be very opportune to speak just now about this contemporary terrestrial art, because, as you said, during our 5th stay there in person, I was really a witness of the events which gave rise to the causes of this contemporary evil there, and which arose, thanks as always to the same learned beings there who assembled in the city of Babylon, from almost the whole of the surface of that ill-fated planet. Having said this, Beelzebub then turned to Hacian and spoke as follows. This same already definite idea there, now existing there under the denomination art, is, at the present time, for those unhappy favorites of yours, one of those automatically acting data that the totality of which, of itself, gradually, and though almost imperceptibly, yet very surely, converts them. That is, beings having in their presences every possibility for becoming particles of a part of divinity, merely into what is called living flesh. For an all-round enlightenment of the question about the famous contemporary terrestrial art, and for your clear understanding of how it all came about, you must first know about 2 facts that occurred in that same city, Babylon, during our 5th flight in person onto the surface of that planet of yours. The first is how and why I then came to be a witness of the events which were the basis of the reasons for the existence among the contemporary 3-brained beings of the planet Earth, of that now definitely maleficent notion called art. And the second is which were the antecedent events that in their turn then served as the origin of the arisings of these reasons. Concerning the first, I must say that during our stay then in the city of Babylon, after the events I have already related, which occurred among always the same learned terrestrial 3-brained beings assembled there from almost the whole planet, that is to say, after they had split into several independent groups and were, as I have already told you, already absorbed in a question of what is called politics, and as I intended at that time to leave Babylon and to continue my observations among the beings of the then already powerful community called Hellas, I decided without delay to learn their speech. From then on, I chose to visit those places in the city of Babylon and meet those beings there, which would be of most use in my practical study of their speech. Once, when I was walking in a certain street of the city of Babylon, not far from our house, I saw on a large building which I had already many times passed, what is called an uka zemotra, or as it is now called on the earth, a signboard, which had been just put up and which announced that a club for foreign learned beings, the adherents of legomonism, had been newly opened in that building. Over the door hung a notice to the effect that the enrollment of members of the club was still going on, and that all reports and scientific discussions would be conducted only in the local and Hellenic languages. This interested me very much, and I thought at once whether it would not be possible for me to make use of this newly opened club for my practice in the Hellenic speech. I then inquired of certain beings who were going in or coming out of that building about the details concerning the club, and when, thanks to the explanation of one learned being, with whom, as I chanced to find out, I was already acquainted, I had made it all more or less clear to myself. I then and there decided to become also a member of that club. Without thinking long about it, I entered the building and, passing myself off as a foreign learned being, I requested as an adherent of legomonism to be enrolled as a member of the club. I managed to do this very easily, owing to that old acquaintance whom I had met by chance and who, like the others, took me for a learned being like himself. Well then, my boy, having thus become what is called a full member of that club, I used afterwards to go there regularly and to talk there chiefly with those learned members who were familiar with the Hellenic speech which I needed. As regards the second fact that proceeded from the following Babylonian events, it must be remarked that among the learned beings of that planet Earth, who were then in Babylon, and who were gathered there partly by coercion from almost the whole of the planet by the mentioned Persian king, and partly voluntarily on account of the already mentioned famous question of the soul, there were several among the beings brought there by coercion who were not, like the majority, learned beings of new formation, but who, with a sincerity proceeding from their separate spiritualized parts, strove for high knowledge only with the aim of self-perfection. Owing to their genuine and sincere striving to the corresponding manner of their existence and to their being acts, these several terrestrial beings had already, even before their arrival in Babylon, been considered initiates of the first degree by those terrestrial three-brained beings, worthy to become what are called all the rights possessing initiates according to the renewed rules of the most saintly Ashiata Shamash. And thus, my boy, when I began going to the said club, it became quite clear to me, both from the conversations with them and from other data, that these several terrestrial learned beings who sincerely strove to perfect their reason had from the beginning kept to themselves in the city of Babylon, and never mixed in any of those affairs with which the general mass of these Babylonian learned beings there of that time very soon became involved. These several learned beings kept themselves apart there, not only in the beginning when all the other learned beings who were then in the city of Babylon first opened a central place for their meetings in the very heart of the city, and when, for their better mutual support, both materially and morally, they founded there a central club for all the learned beings of the earth. But also later on, when the whole body of learned beings were divided into 3 separate sections, and each section had its independent club in one or another part of the city of Babylon, they identified themselves with none of the said 3 sections. They existed in the suburbs of the city of Babylon, and scarcely met any of the learned beings from the general mass. And it was only several days before my admittance among them as a member of this club that they, for the first time, united for the purpose of organizing the club of the adherents of legomonism. These learned beings about whom I am speaking had all, without exception, been taken to the city of Babylon by coercion, and they were, for the most part, those learned beings who had been taken there by the Persian king from Egypt. As I later learned, this uniting of theirs had been brought about by 2 learned beings who were initiates of the first degree. One of these 2 initiated learned beings of the earth, who had his arising among, as they are called, the Moors, was named Kanil el Norkel. The other learned initiated being was named Pythagoras, and he arose from among, as they are called, the Hellenes, those Hellenes who were afterwards called Greeks. As it later became clear to me, these 2 learned beings happened to meet in the city of Babylon, and during what is called their Usa Paga Umnian exchange of opinions, that is to say, during those conversations, the theme of which was, which forms of being existence of the beings can serve for the welfare of the beings of the future, they clearly constated that in the course of the change of generations of beings on the earth, a very undesirable and distressing phenomenon occurs, namely that during the processes of reciprocal destruction, that is, during what are called wars and popular risings, a great number of initiated beings of all degrees are, for some reason or other, invariably destroyed, and together with them there are also destroyed forever very many legal monisms, through which alone various information about former real events on the earth is transmitted and continues to be transmitted from generation to generation. When the 2 mentioned sincere and honest learned beings of the earth constated what they then called such a distressing phenomenon. They deliberated a long time about it, with the result that they decided to take advantage of the exceptional circumstance that so many learned beings were together in one city, to confer collectively for the purpose of finding some means for averting at least this distressing phenomenon, which proceeded on the earth owing to the abnormal conditions of the life of man. And it was just for this purpose that they organized that said club and called it the Club of Adherents of Legal Monism. So many like-thinking beings at once responded to their appeal, that 2 days after my own admission as a member of this club, the enrollment of new members already ceased. And on the day when new members ceased to be admitted, the number of those enrolled amounted to 139 learned beings, and it was with this number of members that the club existed until the said Persian king abandoned his former caprice connected with those terrestrial learned beings. As I learned after my enrollment as a member of that club, all the learned beings had arranged, on the very first day of its opening, a general meeting at which it was unanimously resolved to hold daily general meetings, when reports and discussions on the 2 following questions were to be made, namely, the measures to be taken by the members of the club on their return home for the collection of all the legal monisms existing in their native lands, and for placing them at the disposal of the learned members of this club, which they had founded. And secondly, what was to be done in order that the legal monism might be transmitted to remote generations by some other means than only through initiates. Before my enrollment as a member of the club, a great variety of reports and discussions concerning these 2 mentioned questions had already proceeded at that general meeting of theirs. And on the day of my entry, a great deal was said on the question how to obtain the participation in the main task of the club of initiated beings, of the followers of those so-called ways, then called Onandijiki, shamanists, Buddhists, and so on. Well, then, on the 3rd day after my enrollment as a member of this club, there was uttered for the first time that word which has chanced to reach contemporary beings there, and which has become one of the potent factors of the total atrophy of all the still surviving data for more or less normal logical being mentation, namely the word art, which was then used in a different sense, and whose definition referred to quite a different idea and had quite another meaning. This word was uttered in the following circumstances. On the day when the word art was used for the first time, and its real idea and exact meaning were established among the other reporters, there stepped forward a Chaldean learned being, very well known in those times, named as Sharpanziar, who was then also a member of the Club for Legal Monists. As the report of that already very aged Chaldean learned being, the great Aksharpanziar, was then the origin for all the further events connected with this same contemporary art there. I will try to recall his speech and repeat it to you as nearly as possible, word for word. He then said as follows: "The past, and especially the last 2 centuries, have shown us that during those inevitable psychoses of the masses, from which wars between states and various popular revolts within states always arise, many of the innocent victims of the popular bestiality are invariably those who, owing to their piety and conscious sacrifices, are worthy to be initiates, and through whom various legal monisms containing information about all kinds of real events, which have taken place in the past, are transmitted to the conscious beings of succeeding generations. Just such pious men as these always become such innocent victims of the popular bestiality, only because, in my opinion, being already free within and never wholly identifying themselves, as all the rest do, with all the ordinary interests of those around them, They cannot, for that reason, participate either in the attractions, pleasures, and sentiments, or in the similarly, clearly sincere manifestations of those around them. And in spite of the fact that in ordinary times they exist normally and in their relations with those around them are always well-wishing in both their inner and outer manifestations, and thus acquire in normal periods of everyday life the respect and esteem of those around them. Yet, when the mass of ordinary people fall into the said psychosis and split into their usual two opposing camps, then these latter, in their state of bestialized reason, during their fighting, begin to entertain morbid suspicions of just those who in normal times have always been unassuming and serious. And then, if it should happen that the attention of those under this psychosis should rest a little longer on these exceptional men, they no longer have any doubt whatever that these serious and outwardly always quiet men have undoubtedly also in normal times been nothing more nor less than the spies of their present enemies and foes. With their diseased reasons, these bestialized men categorically conclude that the previous seriousness and quietness of such men were nothing else but simply what are called secrecy and duplicity. And the result of the psychopathic conclusions of these bestialized men of one or the other hostile party is that without any remorse of conscience whatever, they put these serious and quiet men to death. In my opinion, what I have just said has most frequently been the cause why the legal monisms about events which really took place on the earth have, in the course of their passage from generation to generation, also totally disappeared from the face of the earth. Well then, my highly esteemed colleagues, if you wish to know my personal opinion, then I shall sincerely tell you with all my being that in spite of all I have told you about the transmission of true knowledge to distant generations through corresponding initiates by means of legal monisms, there is now nothing whatever to be done through these means. Let this means be continued as before, as it has been on the earth from the dawn of centuries, and as this form of transmission by initiates, through their ableness to be, was renewed by the great prophet Ashyata Shiyamash. If we, contemporary men, desire at the present time to do something beneficent for men of future times, all we must do is just to add to this already existing means of transmission some new means or other, ensuing from the ways of our contemporary life on the earth, as well as from the many-centuried experience of former generations, in accordance with the information that has come down to us. I personally suggest that this transmission to future generations be made through the human, what are called afalkalna, that is, through various productions of man's hands, which have entered into use in the daily life of the people, and also through the human soljinoha, that is, through various procedures and ceremonies which have already been established for centuries in the social and family life of people, and which automatically pass from generation to generation. Either these human afalkalna themselves, and in particular those which are made of lasting materials, will survive and for various reasons will be handed down to men of distant generations, or copies of them will pass from generation to generation, thanks to the property which is rooted in the essence of man, of giving out as one's own, after having changed some minor detail, one or another of the productions of man which have reached them from long past epochs. In regard to the human soljinoha, as for instance various mysteries, religious ceremonies, family and social customs, religious and popular dances, and so on, then although they often change in their external form with the flow of time, yet the impulses engendered in man through them, and the manifestations of man derived from them, always remain the same, and thus, by placing the various useful information and true knowledge we have already attained within the inner factors which engender these impulses, and these useful manifestations, we can fully count on their reaching our very remote descendants, some of whom will decipher them and thereby enable all the rest to utilize them for their good. The question now is only this: by what means can such a transmission through the various human Avalkalna and Soljinoha, as I have described, be actualized? I personally suggest that this be done through the universal law called the Law of Sevenfoldness. The law of sevenfoldness exists on the earth and will exist forever and in everything. For instance, in accordance with this law, there are in the white ray 7 independent colors. In every definite sound there are 7 different independent tones. In every state of man, 7 different independent sensations. Further, every definite form can be made up of only 7 different dimensions. Every weight remains at rest on the earth only thanks to 7 reciprocal thrusts, and so on. Well then, of the knowledge now existing, which we have personally attained, or which has reached us from times past, just that knowledge which we shall agree is useful for our remote descendants must be indicated in some way or other in the said human Avalkalna and Soljinoha, so that in the future it may be perceived by the pure reason of man by means of this great universal law. I repeat that the law of sevenfoldness will exist on the earth as long as the universe exists, and it will be seen and understood by men in all times as long as human thought exists on the earth. And it can therefore boldly be said that the knowledge indicated in this manner in the mentioned productions will exist also forever on the earth. And as regards the method itself, that is to say, the mode of transmission through this law, in my opinion, it can be actualized in the following way. In all the productions which we shall intentionally create on the basis of this law for the purpose of transmitting to remote generations, we shall intentionally introduce certain also lawful inexactitudes, and in these lawful inexactitudes we shall place, by means available to us, the contents of some true knowledge or other which is already in the possession of men at the present time. In any case, for the interpretation itself, or as may be said, for the key to those inexactitudes in that great law, we shall further make in our productions something like a legomonism, and we shall secure its transmission from generation to generation through initiates of a special kind, whom we shall call initiates of art. And we shall call them so because the whole process of such a transmission of knowledge to remote generations through the law of sevenfoldness will not be natural, but artificial. And so, my highly accomplished and impartial colleagues, it must now be clear to you that if for some reason or another the information useful for our descendants concerning knowledge already attained by men about past events on the earth fails to reach them through genuine initiates, then, thanks to these new means of transmission which I have suggested, men of future generations will always be able to reflect upon and make clear to themselves, if not everything now already existing, then at least those particular fragments of the common knowledge already existing on the earth, which chance to reach them through these said productions of the hands of contemporary men, as well as through those various existing ceremonies in which, by means of this great law of sevenfoldness, and with the help of these artificial indications of ours, we shall now put what we wish. With these words, the great Akshar Panziar then concluded his report. Considerable excitement and noisy discussion followed his speech among all the members of the club of the adherents of legomonism, and the outcome of it was that they then and there unanimously decided to do as the great Akshar Panziar had suggested. A brief interval was then allowed for eating, after which they all assembled again, and the second general meeting of that day continued throughout the night. Well, the unanimous decision was then carried to begin the following day making what are called minia images, or as the contemporary three-brained beings call them, models, of various productions, to try to work out the possible and most suitable means of indication on the principles laid down by the great Akshar, and thereafter to bring these minia images or models of theirs to the club for exhibition and exposition to the other members. Within the following 2 days, many of them already began bringing the minia images they had made and showing them with the appropriate explanations, and they also began demonstrating every variety of those acts which beings of that planet had before occasionally performed in the process of their ordinary existence, and which they still manifest up till now. Among the number of the models they brought and the various being manifestations they demonstrated were combinations of different colors, forms of various constructions and buildings, the playing on various musical instruments, the singing of every kind of melody, and also the exact representation of various experiencings foreign to them, and so on and so forth. Shortly after, for the sake of convenience, the members of the club divided themselves into a number of groups, and each seventh part, which they called a day, of that definite period of time, which they called a week, they devoted to the demonstration and exposition of their productions in one particular branch of knowledge. Here it is interesting to notice that this definite period of the flow of time, namely a week, has always been divided on your planet into 7 days. And this division was even made by the beings of the continent Atlantis, who expressed in it that same law of sevenfoldness with which they were quite familiar. The days of the week were then on the continent Atlantis called as follows: 1. Adash Sikra, 2. Ivos Sikra, 3. Sevork Sikra, 4. Mido Sikra, 5. Maiko Sikra, 6. Luku Sikra, 7. Sonia Sikra. These names were changed there many times, and at present the beings there name the days of the week thus: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Well then, as I have already told you, they then devoted each day of the week to the production of one or another specialty, either of their hands or of some other form of consciously designed being manifestation. Namely, Mondays they devoted to the first group, and this day was called the Day of Religious and Civil Ceremonies. Tuesdays were given over to the second group and was called the Day of Architecture. Wednesday was called the Day of Painting. Thursday, the Day of Religious and Popular Dances. Friday, the Day of Sculpture. Saturday, the Day of Mysteries, or as it was also called, the Day of the Theater. Sunday, the Day of Music and Song. On Mondays, namely on the Day of Religious and Civil Ceremonies, the learned beings of the first group demonstrated various ceremonies in which the fragments of knowledge that had been previously selected for transmission were indicated by means of inexactitudes in the law of sevenfoldness, chiefly in the inexactitudes of the lawful movements of the participants in the given ceremonies. For instance, let us suppose that the leader of the given ceremony, the priest, or according to contemporaries, the clergyman, has to raise his arms towards heaven. This posture of his infallibly demands, in accordance with the law of sevenfoldness, that his feet should normally be placed in a certain position. But these Babylonian learned beings intentionally put the feet of the said leader of the ceremony not as they should be placed in accordance with this law, but otherwise. And in general, it was just in all these otherwises that the learned beings of that group indicated in the movements of the participants in the given religious ceremony by a conventional what is called alphabet, those ideas which they intended should be transmitted through these ceremonies to the men beings of their remote descendants. on Tuesdays, namely on the day of architecture, the learned beings belonging to the second group brought various models for such proposed buildings and constructions as could endure a very long time. And in this case, they set up these buildings not exactly in accordance with the stability ensuing from the law of sevenfoldness, or as the beings there were mechanically already accustomed to do, but otherwise. For instance, the cupola of a certain construction had, according to all the data, to rest on 4 columns of a certain thickness and definite strength. But they placed this said cupola on only 3 columns, and the reciprocal thrust, or as it is also expressed, the reciprocal resistance, ensuing from the law of sevenfoldness for supporting the surplanetary weight, they took not from the columns alone, but also from other unusual combinations ensuing from the same law of sevenfoldness, with which the mass of the ordinary beings of that time were also already acquainted. That is to say, they took the required degree of resistance of the columns, chiefly from the force of the weight of the cupola itself. Or still another example. A certain stone, according to all the data established there, both mechanically from long-centuried practice and also thanks to the fully conscious calculations of certain beings with reason there, ought infallibly to have its definite strength corresponding to a certain power of resistance. But they infallibly made and placed this cornerstone so that it did not correspond at all to the mentioned data, but the strength and power of resistance for the support of the superimposed weight required on the basis of the law of sevenfoldness, they took from the setting of the lower stones, which in their turn they did not lay according to the established custom, but again they based their calculations on the manner of laying the still lower stones, and so on. And it was just in these unusual combinations of the laying of stones, ensuing from the law of sevenfoldness, that they indicated, also by means of a conventional alphabet, the contents of some or other useful information. This group of learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism further indicated what they wished in their minia images or models of proposed constructions by utilizing the law called David Briskar, that is, the law of the action of the vibrations arising in the atmosphere of enclosed spaces. This law, which has utterly failed to reach the contemporary 3-brained beings of that planet, was then quite familiar to the beings there. That is to say, they were already quite aware that the size and form of enclosed spaces and also the volume of air enclosed in them influence beings in particular ways. Utilizing this law, they indicated their various ideas in the following way. Let us suppose that according to the character and purpose of some building or other, it is required that from the interiors of the given building, in accordance with the law of sevenfoldness and with the mechanical practice of centuries, definite sensations must be evoked in a certain lawful sequence. Then, utilizing the law of Daiva Briskar, they combined the interiors of this proposed building in such a way that the required sensations were evoked in the beings who entered them, not in the anticipated familiar lawful sequence, but in some other order. And it was just in these deviations from the lawful sequence of sensations that they placed whatever they wished in a certain way. Wednesdays, the day of painting, were devoted to the combining of different colors. On those days, the learned beings of the given group brought for demonstration every kind of object necessary for domestic use, made of such colored materials as could last a very long time. Namely, they brought carpets, fabrics, chinkuaris, that is, drawings made in various colors on specially tanned leather, capable of lasting many centuries, and things of similar kind. By means of variegated colors of threads, various representations of the nature of their planet, and various forms of beings also breeding there, were drawn or embroidered on these productions. before continuing to speak about in which way these terrestrial learned beings then indicated various fragments of knowledge in their combinations of various colors, one fact concerning what I am just relating must be noticed. A fact definitely distressing for those favorites of yours, and which was also obtained in their presences on account of the same abnormal forms of their daily existence established by them themselves. First, I wish to explain to you also about the gradual change for the worse in the quality of the formation in them of those organs of perception which should be formed in the presence of every kind of being, and about the organ which in this case particularly interests us, the organ for the perception and distinguishing of what is called the blending of gravity center vibrations, which reach their planet from the spaces of the universe. I am speaking about what is called the common integral vibration of all sources of actualizing, namely, about that which the learned being Akshar Pansiar, of whom I spoke, called the white ray, and about the perceptions of impressions from separate blendings of gravity center vibrations, which are distinguished by beings as separate what are called tonalities of color. You must know that at the very beginning of the arising and existence of the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, before the period when the organ Kundabuffer was interjected into them, and later when this organ was totally removed from their presences, and even after the second Transapollonian catastrophe there, almost up to the time of our third flight in person to the surface of that planet, the said organ was actualized in them with what is called a sensibility of perception, similar to that which is actualized in the common presences of all ordinary three-brained beings of the whole of our great universe. Formerly, at the periods mentioned, in all the three-brained beings arising on this planet, this organ was formed with the sensibility of perceiving the mentioned blendings of separate gravity center vibrations of the white ray, and of distinguishing 1/3 of the quantity of the tonalities of color of all the tonalities obtained in the presences of the planets, as well as in all other greater and smaller cosmic concentrations. Objective science has already accurately established that the number of separate interblendings of gravity center vibrations from the common integral vibration, namely the tonalities of color, is exactly equal to 1 Hultan Panas. That is to say, according to the calculations of the terrestrial three-brained beings of 5,764,801 tonalities. Only 1/3 of this total number of the blendings of tonalities, with the exception of the one tonality which is accessible only to the perception of our all-maintaining endlessness. That is to say, 1,921,600 tonalities, perceived by the beings as differences of color, can be perceived by all the ordinary beings on whatever planet of our great universe they arise. But if the three-brained beings complete the perfecting of their highest part, their perceiving organ of visibility thereby acquires the sensibility of what is called ules tes noknian, sight. Then they can already distinguish 2/3 of the total number of tonalities existing in the universe, which number, according to terrestrial calculation, amounts to 3,843,200 differences of tonality of color. And only those three-brained beings who perfect their highest being part to the state of what is called Ishmesh become able to perceive and distinguish all the mentioned number of blendings and tonalities, with the exception of that one tonality which, as I have already told you, is accessible to the perception only of our all-maintaining Creator. Although I intend to explain to you in detail, in the future, how and why in the presences of the Issa-Pollonian cosmic concentrations, every kind of definite formation acquires the property, from evolving and involving processes, of producing various effects upon the mentioned organ of the beings, Nevertheless, I do not consider it superfluous to touch upon this question also now. It is necessary to say, first of all, that according to the completed result of the fundamental cosmic law of the holy Heptaparaparshinok, that is, that cosmic law which was called by the three-brained beings of the planet Earth of the mentioned Babylonian period the law of sevenfoldness, the common integral vibration, like all the already definitized cosmic formations, is formed and consists of 7 what are called complexes of results, or, as it is also sometimes said, of 7 classes of vibrations. Of those cosmic sources, the arising and further action of each of which also arise and depend on 7 other, which in their turn arise and depend on 7 further ones, and so on, right up to the first most holy, unique 7-propertied vibration, issuing from the most holy prime source. And altogether they compose the common integral vibration of all the sources of the actualizing of everything existing in the whole of the universe. And thanks to the transformations of these latter, they afterwards actualize in the presences of the cosmic Isoponian concentrations, the said number of the various tonalities of color. And as regards the details of the most holy, unique 7-propertied vibrations, you will understand them only when, as I have already many times promised you, I shall have explained to you in detail, in its proper time, all about the most great fundamental laws of world creation and world maintenance. And meanwhile, concerning the given case, you ought to know that when this said common integral vibration, that is, what the terrestrial three-brained beings call the white ray, enters with its presence proper to it into the spheres of the possibilities, for its transformation in the presence of an Insiponian planet, then there proceeds also in it, just as in the case of every already definitized cosmic arising possessing the possibility of still further actualization, that cosmic process called Jartklom, that is, it itself remains as a presence, but its essence, as it were, disintegrates and produces processes for evolution and involution by the separate gravity center vibrations of its arising, and these processes are actualized thus. One of the gravity center vibrations is derived from the others and is transformed into a third, and so on. During such transformations, this said common integral vibration, that is, the white ray, acts with its gravity center vibrations upon other ordinary processes proceeding nearby in intraplanetary and surplanetary arisings and decompositions, and owing to kindred vibrations, its gravity center vibrations, dependently upon and in accordance with the surrounding conditions, blend and become a part of the whole common presence of these definite intraplanetary or surplanetary formations, in which the said processes proceed. Well then, my boy, during the periods of my descent in person to the planet Earth, I, at first without any conscious intention on the part of my reason, and later already quite intentionally, noticed and finally, definitely constated the progressive deterioration in all of them of this being organ also. Deteriorating century by century, the sensibility of perception of that organ also, namely the organ by means of which there chiefly proceeds for the presences of the three-brained beings what is called the automatic satiation of externals, which is the basis for the possibility of natural self-perfecting, had reached such a point that at the time of our 5th stay there, during the period called by the contemporary beings there the period of the greatness of Babylon, that organ of theirs could perceive and distinguish the blending of the gravity center vibrations of the white ray, at most up to the 3rd degree only of what are called its 7-fold strata, that is, up to only 343 different tonalities of color. Here it is interesting to note that Quite a number of the three-brained beings of the Babylonian epic themselves already suspected the gradual deterioration of the sensibility of that organ of theirs, and certain of them even founded a new society in Babylon that started a peculiar movement among the painters of that time. This peculiar movement of the painters of that time had the following program: to find out and elucidate the truth only through the tonalities existing between white and black. And they executed all their productions exclusively utilizing only the tonalities ensuing from black up to white. When I got to know of that particular movement of painting there in Babylon, its followers were already using for their productions about 1,500 very definite shades of what is called the color gray. This new movement in painting there, among the beings who were also striving to learn the truth, at least in something, made what is called a great stir. And it was even the basis for the arising of another and still more peculiar movement, this time among what are called the Babylonian Nuxomists, among just those beings of that time who studied and produced what are called new combinations of concentrations of vibrations, which act in a definite way on the sense of smell of the beings, and which produce definite effects in their general psyche. That is to say, among those beings there who made it their aim to find the truth by means of smells. Certain beings who were then enthused by this founded in imitation of the followers of the said branch of painters a similar society, and the motto of their new movement was to search the truth in the shades of smells obtained between the moment of the action of cold at freezing and the moment of the action at warm decomposition. Like the painters, they also then found between these said two definite smells about 700 very definite shades, which they employed in their elucidating experiments. I do not know to what these two peculiar movements then in Babylon would have led and where they would have ceased if a newly appointed chief of the city during the time we were there had not begun prosecuting the followers of that second new movement, because with their already sufficiently keen sense of smell they had begun to notice and unwittingly to expose certain of his what are called shady dealings, with the result that he used every possible means to suppress everything conducted not only with that second new movement, but with the first as well. As regards that organ of theirs about which we began to speak, namely the organ for the perception of the visibility of other cosmic arisings which were beyond them, the deterioration of its sensibility, continuing also after the Babylonian period, reached the point that during our last stay on the surface of this planet, your favorites already had the possibility of perceiving and distinguishing, instead of the 1,921,600 tonalities of color, which they ought to have perceived and distinguished, only the result of the penultimate, what is called sevenfold crystallizations of the white ray, that is, 49 tonalities. And even then, only some of your favorites had that capacity, while the rest, perhaps the majority, were deprived of even this possibility. But what is most interesting in respect of this progressive deterioration of that most important part of their common presence is the sorry farce that results, namely, that those contemporary three-brained beings there who can still manage to distinguish the mentioned miserable fraction of the total number of tonalities, namely merely 49, look down with superior self-conceit and with an admixture of the impulse of pride upon those other beings who have lost the capacity to distinguish even this miserable number, as upon beings with an abnormal deficiency in that said organ of theirs, and they call them diseased, afflicted by what is called Daltonism. The last 7 blendings of the gravity center vibrations of the white ray, which, just as now among the contemporary beings there, they then had in Babylon, have the following names: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Now, here in just which way the learned beings then in Babylon, belonging to the group of painters, indicated various useful information and fragments of the knowledge they had attained in the lawful inexactitudes of the great cosmic law, then called the law of sevenfoldness, by means of the combinations of the mentioned 7 independent definite colors and other secondary tonalities ensuing from them. In accordance with that definite property of the common integral vibration, that is, of the white ray, during the process of its transformations about which I have just spoken, and which was already then familiar to the Babylonian learned painters, one of its gravity center vibrations, or one of the separate colors of the white ray, always ensues from another, and is transformed into a third, as for example the orange color is obtained from the red, and further itself passes in its turn into yellow, and so on and so forth. So whenever the Babylonian learned painters wove or embroidered with colored threads or colored their productions, they inserted the distinctions of the tonalities of the colors in the cross lines as well as in the horizontal lines, and even in the intersecting lines of color, not in the lawful sequence in which this process really proceeds, in accordance with the law of sevenfoldness, but otherwise, and in these also lawful otherwises, they place the contents of some or other information or knowledge. On Thursdays, namely the days which the learned beings of this group assigned for sacred and popular dances, there were demonstrated with the necessary explanations every possible form of religious and popular dances, either those already existing, which they only modified, or quite new ones, which they created. And in order that you should have a better idea and well understand in which way they indicated what they wished in these dances, you must know that the learned beings of this time had already long been aware that every posture and movement of every being in general, in accordance with the same law of sevenfoldness, always consists of 7 what are called mutually balanced tensions, arising in 7 independent parts of their whole, and that each of these 7 parts in their turn consists of 7 different what are called lines of movement, and each line has 7 what are called points of dynamic concentration. And all this that I have just described, being repeated in the same way and in the same sequence, but always on a diminishing scale, is actualized in the minutest sizes of the total bodies called atoms. And so, during their dances, in the movements lawful in their accordance with each other, these learned dancers inserted intentional inexactitudes, also lawful, and in a certain way indicated in them the information and knowledge which they wished to transmit. On Fridays, days devoted to sculpture, the learned beings belonging to this group brought and demonstrated what were then called minia images or models, and which were made from the material there called clay. Those minia images or models, which they brought for exhibition and familiarization, represented, as a rule, individual beings or various groups of beings, either similar to them or of other beings of all kinds of exterior form, breeding on their planet. Among these productions were also various what are called allegorical beings, which were represented with the head of one form of a being there, with the body of another, and with the limbs of a third, and so on. The learned beings belonging to this group indicated all that was requisite in the lawful inexactitudes allowed by them in connection with what was then called the law of dimensions. You must know that to all the 3-brained beings of the earth, and also, of course, to the sculptors of that period, it was already known that, in accordance always with the same great law of sevenfoldness, the dimensions of any definite part of any whole being ensue from the 7 dimensions of other of his secondary parts, which in their turn ensue from 7 tertiary parts, and so on and so forth. According to this, each large or small part of the whole totality of the planetary body of a being has exactly proportionately increasing or diminishing dimensions in relation to his other parts. For a clear understanding of what I have just said, the face of any three-brained being can serve as a good example. The facial dimensions of every three-centered being in general, and also the facial dimensions of the three-centered beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy, are the result of the dimensions of 7 different fundamental parts of the whole of his body. And the dimensions of each separate part of the face is the result of 7 different dimensions of the whole face. For instance, the dimensions of the nose of any being are derived from the dimensions of the other parts of the face. And on his nose, in its turn, there are actualized 7 definite what are called surfaces, and these surfaces also have 7 lawful dimensions, down to the said atom itself of this face of theirs, which, as I have said, is one of the 7 independent dimensions composing the dimensions of the whole planetary body. In the deviations from these lawful dimensions, the learned sculptors, among the members of the adherents of legal monism, then in the city of Babylon, indicated all kinds of useful information and fragments of knowledge already known to them, which they intended to transmit to the beings of remote generations.